Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We are gathered in this Zoom space in God's presence. Let us worship God.
Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up.
Estas palavras que hoje te ordeno estarão no teu coração. Tu as inculcarás a teus filhos e delas falarás assentado em tua casa e andando pelo caminho e ao deitar-te e ao levantar-te. Também as atarás como sinal na tua mão e te serão por frontal entre os teus olhos. E as escreverás nos umbrais de tua casa e nas tuas portas.
The word of the Lord. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. We are gathered to share stories. And as we gather to share the stories of courage, of hope, of women's leadership and activism and advocacy, we wade in the waters of the biblical narrative, hearing from our sisters, Miriam, who stood at the river's edge, ensuring that her brother Moses was protected and cared for. We gather in the water with Pharaoh's daughter, who for many is nameless, and yet she dared to lower her guard to be there for those women and that child who would churn and turn and disrupt the pages of history. We gather in the water beside Vashti, who dared to say to her husband, "Your policies of exploitation and abuse are wrong, and I will not be a part of it." We gather, sisters and brothers, sharing the stories of Esther, who dared to say, "If I perish, so let it be." What is your story, and where do you find yourself in this water of reflection as we think about women's leadership, named and unnamed, at the Manchester Pan-African Congress and the days and weeks and years since then? So let us gather, let us reflect, and let us join in at the water of life, seeking restoration, seeking refreshment, and offering that life-giving outpouring for one and all. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God come trouble or water. Life divine, be with us, we pray. In Jesus' name, Ashe and Amen. As we gather for this very historic and auspicious pre-meeting, pre-conference, pre-gathering of women primarily, to hear our stories and to share our joys, even our pain, I have the joy of introducing for us our moderator for the day, Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith. She is the Senior Associate for Pan-African and Orthodox Faith Engagement at Bread for the World in Washington, D.C., bringing extensive global, national, and local experience as a faith and public engagement thought leader, journalist, speaker, broadcaster, scholar, preacher, and author. Reverend Dr. Smith, Walker-Smith, is the President Clinton, Senate Richard Lugar, former Indiana Governor Mike Pence, and other distinguished leaders who have awarded her with her distinction in leadership. Angelique received her doctorate degree from Princeton Theological Seminary and the former director and minister of the Church Council in Greater Indianapolis, Indiana. She's a member of the Home Mission Board for the National Baptist Convention USA, Inc., a World Council of Churches and National Council of Churches Governing Board member. And Dr. Walker-Smith is the president of Historic Black Churches at one of the widest represented bodies of national churches and their related networks of Christianity in the US. Most recently, Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith was selected to be a member of the preparatory working group for the new United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. She's also the international co-convener for the African and Africans in Diaspora Manchester Conference. Ladies, sisters, water waders all, please use your emoticons, please use your hands to join in welcoming our moderator for today, Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith.
My very dear sister, the Reverend Nikki Ashwood, thank you for your very generous introduction. Thank you for your very moving opening devotion. We begin with prayer, and this conference will end with prayer. And every day we will begin our days with prayer and devotions, because to God we give the glory. Thank you for leading us in the manner and the temperament to which we bring to this work on this week. It is such a distinguished honor and my deep joy to be in the presence of all of you, the women who will be leading the time together, but all who have gathered, who have sacrificed their time, their talent, their treasure to join us for this journey of this historic Pan-African Renaissance Conference. Africans and Africans in Diaspora, the Manchester Conference, highlighting 1945 of the Pan-African Congress that was held. But to be clear, to even think about 1900, when the Congresses began after the shameful scrambling for Africa in the late 1800s, during the heyday of the missionary movement. And then to think about what happened after 1945, as we think about how women in particular in her story intervened, disrupted, even in Tanzania for the 1974 Pan-African Congress. Yes, so many stories, her stories, unfortunately, have not been as visible in this conversation. But today we offer a rewriting of the narrative. We offer an opportunity to be more inclusive in reflecting her story with his story and all the stories that may even yet need to be told. So you are most welcome to this journey. All of this week, we will be revisiting the narratives of people of Africa and of African descent. We will be honored by VIPs and guests as are on the panel today throughout the entire week. So please, this is a time to open our hearts, to open our minds to new vistas and retelling and decolonizing knowledge and decolonizing narratives that belong to us, but belong to the world that is yet to be revealed and made visible in this moment. We thank God that we are in a new Kairos moment in which these rewritten narratives can be shared and embraced. So to the worldwide ecumenical family, we thank you for being a sojourner with us, people of Africa and of African descent, to allow for this moment. We thank all of our partners. We thank especially our South African hosts who have worked strenuously to bring us to this moment. We thank the World Council of Churches for the sacred space in which the seeds were planted in Switzerland for a Central Committee meeting when Africans and Africans in diaspora of faith met together and envisioned this moment. We thank God for you, and we look forward to what will yet come, even as we think about the Conference of Pan-African Women and Pan-African Women's Ecumenical Empowerment Network that will have its annual conference in November, and we will hear more about that during the time together. And even as we prepare for next year for the World Assembly, the 11th World Assembly of the World Council of Churches that will be held, inshallah, in Germany, in Karlsruhe, where there will be a pre-women's conference. Thank you, Reverend Ashwood, for your leadership with the advisory group that will lead us in that time together to revisit this conversation and also during the assembly itself. So we are a part of the journey. We thank God for you and look forward to what the outcomes will be after this conference and into the future. It is now my distinct pleasure. It is my distinct joy to serve as your moderator for the rest of this time together as all the amazing voices you will hear come forward for this time together. One of the persons who I have the great joy of introducing is my co-convener with the International Conference of the African and Diaspora Manchester Conference. He is a brother beloved. He is someone who is an anti-apartheid icon. He and Dr. Bam, who you will hear later, we are deeply honored that he is here with us today to share what it is it's on his heart as the co-convener for this time together. Just a bit more about the Reverend Frank Chikane. The Reverend Frank Chikane was born in Johannesburg. His father was a preacher in the Apostolic Faith Mission Church. The Reverend Chikane attended Orlando High School in Soweto, where he matriculated before registering at the University of the North, Turloop, in 1972 to study science. It was there that he met the current president of South Africa, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa. And we will hear from him on tomorrow in the sessions, just as information. As a student, he became politically aware, being influenced largely by the Black consciousness ideology. Thus, he became involved in the activities of the South African Student Organization, SASO. At the university, this is where that took place. His political activism led to his repeated detention, which in turn disrupted his education, forcing him to leave the university in 1974. But Reverend Chikane later continued his education, obtaining a Master of Arts degree from Harvard University and a Master of Theology from the University of Natal, now KwaZulu-Natal. Reverend Chikane completed his training as a pastor at the Apostolic Faith Mission. He was subsequently defrocked in 1981 due to his political stance. After the end of apartheid, however, he was reinstated as the prophet that we have come to know in his iconic presence. Reverend Chikane was detained, released on various occasions between January 1977 and 1985. And it was in the 80s that Reverend Chikane became involved with the United Democratic Front, becoming the vice president of the Transvaal region from 1983 to 1985. Subsequently, he was arrested, charged and tried for treason in February 1985. The charges were later dropped. He then served as the director of the Institute of Contextual Theology, in a position he held to 1987. In July 1987, he was elected the general secretary of the South African Council of Churches. And that's where I'm honored to say is where I met the Reverend Chikane. He followed the Dr. Myers Nalde, who many may know as also another icon of the anti-apartheid struggle. The police then went to harass the South African Council of Churches as their offices were raided the same year that he was appointed. But it was in 1988 that Reverend Chikani's autobiography, No Life of My Own, was published, and this gives life to his narrative. In the 1990s, Reverend Chikani remained involved with the SACC and later the task of carrying the organization through the period of change. In 1994, he began as a Director General in the Office of the Deputy President, President Thabo Mbeki, and remained there to 1999. In 2007, the former security officers in South Africa's apartheid regime received suspension prison sentences for plotting to kill Reverend Chikani. The former police minister, Adrian Vlok, and his police chief, Jonathan van der Merwe, received suspended 10-year sentences. In 2009, media reports circulated that he was nominated by Congress of the People. And it was in July 2010 that he published his 8-part series. In March 2012, he launched his second book. He has had many positions since that time. Suffice it to say, his biography commends him for this moment. And it's been a profound pleasure and honor to work with him so closely in this conference development. The Reverend Chikani will give us greetings, and then we will go to the next item on our agenda. Reverend Chikani, thank you. God bless you. We thank God for you and how you have led all of us in very intense moments of struggle over the years and still continue the fight as we even work together for this conference. Over to you, Reverend Chikani, and God bless you. Reverend Chikani, are you there?
The mic, Frank, open the mic.
Yes, we must be unmuted to speak.
Talking alone. I must say that I'm pleased to be part of this pre-conference, which leads into the sessions we're going to have during the Africa and African Diaspora Conference. And I'm pleased to be with the women leaders who have been working on this matter over some time. So it's not one event matter. We met at one stage on the WCC Central Committee and in the meetings of the Central Committee. And people of African descent and Africans felt the time had come for us to deal with the issues relating to people of African descent. And as we go through the conference, you will then notice as well that we're going to deal with the issue about Pan-Africanism for all and with all. And that's why today it's focusing on women, because they have to be part of that critical family. And they are critical in terms of the liberation struggle we want to fight. I want to start with the issue, the famous quote from Frantz Fanon, and those who want to get from this, the scriptures can go to Acts 13:36. But Frantz, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission and fulfill it or betray it. And we feel that there are generations that have gone before us, Du Bois and others, who started in 1900, fighting this struggle against this experience of transatlantic slavery and colonization, dictatorships that were subjected to, and all the negative experiences. We felt it is time to make a difference. We are convinced that unless we deal with the situation of people of African descent and Africans, the conditions under which they live, we will not be able to defeat racism. I am convinced that as long as if the color of a person is associated with poverty and suffering, the issue about racism will remain. And so that's why we decided we needed, during our generation, to really build on the rest of the Pan-African congresses that have been held and conferences, to take this matter further, to conclude it, and bring people of African descent at the cutting edge of the world's development, economies, and be able to make the contribution we made and used to make before this disruption. And that's why we are gathering together. And I would like to say our best wishes as you gather together to deal with these subjects. We will be dealing with we have a concept paper which you know about, has been distributed, and we'll be dealing with all those things throughout the week until Friday. And then we make decisions on action plans to make a difference in this world. So I would like to thank you. I don't want to take more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Chikani. We are very grateful for your opening comments and look forward to the other words that will come over the next week and the action plan that will yet to follow. Now it is my joy to bring on another sister who has been leading us in the global space and to introduce her to you, who will come and give us her remarks as well. It is now then my joy to welcome in this space, Minister Naomi Jordan Cook, and she is a well-known technology expert and also a minister in her church. She comes to us from the United States and works closely as the co-leader, co-convener of the Rewriting the Narrative work group of Pan-African Women Ecumenical Empowerment Network. She is the president, co-founder of the Virtual Global Consultant Group in 2016, which designs and develops e-commerce systems that help generate revenue online for companies and customizes digital platforms and software that make shipping and collecting payment easier for businesses in emerging markets. She's responsible for helping to generate millions of dollars a year at will with donations and businesses for her clients, and special focus on faith-based organizations and African-based companies. With more than 15 years of professional experience in technology, Minister Jordan Cook has a passion of creating, building, and maintaining online platforms. And she specializes in expanding brand visibility, driving engagement to increase donations, sales online for clients. She is the co-author of the book, Cyber Church Today, Online Marketing Tools for the 21st Century. She holds a Master of Science degree in Internet Technology, as well as various certificates in Internet Marketing, Web Development, and Computer Program. She has completed the Expo Tech program of the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the U.S. Department of Commerce. As I say, she is co-convener of our Rewriting the Narrative work with the Pan-African Women of Faith Network. Let us welcome together Minister Naomi Jordan Cook, who will introduce the work in which she worked as a team with PAW and Pauline to tell the story of Pan-African women. Minister Jordan Cook, the floor is yours. Pan-African Women of Faith presents Sankofa, Pan-African Women of Faith Matter. We, women of faith who are African and of African descent, are called to action at this Sankofa moment of Ubuntu. This moment calls for boldness of faith and joy, peace, love, and persistent courage
that our foremothers and our forefathers brought to bear and empowers us for this moment, our children, and the unborn. San means return. Ko means go. Fa means look, see, and take. Sankofa. Sankofa suggests a season of looking back and forward. The definition of Sankofa is based on the ancient understanding of the past, serving as a guide for planning the future. This understanding conveys the importance of wisdom in learning from the past, which ensures a strong future. In this Sankofa moment, we advance these key messages. 1, Africa at heart. 2, lifting Pan-African women's voices in unity in our diversities. Advocacy for justice, number 3. And number 4, the ongoing relevance of the season of the 2019 Quadcentennial. African at heart. We receive the gift of being African at heart, individually and collectively. When we do this, we invite and engage a strong cultural identity, common heritage, values, and ethics of Pan-Africanism. It is in so doing, we call on a robust change in the negative perceptions of Africans or peoples of African descent as the poor, downtrodden, and ineffective, to a more positive narrative of a people taking charge of their destiny and making a positive impact on their lives as a people and as individuals. We demand a better understanding of respect and recognition of our diverse cultures and of our traditions. Oh, the ongoing relevance of the season of 2019 Quadcentennial also is a key message. Absolutely vital to the formation of English-speaking America was the voyage made by a Spanish ship with some 60 stolen enslaved Africans from present-day Angola. They were brought to the young struggling colony of Jamestown in 1619. It was an act of colonial piracy that angered King James I of England, causing him to carve up the London Virginian Company's monopoly for virtually all of North America. End of quote. Further, it was in Jamestown when the origins of the codification of legalized slavery in the United States began in the states for African and African-descended peoples. Today, Africa's diaspora in the African Union's 6th region, whether displaced because of the enslavement or colonial periods, or because of modern-day migration, the Africa diaspora is part of Africa's history and future. The 6th region was constructed to honor and invite the American family outside of the continent to participate in our future together. Lifting Pan-African women's voices in unity in our diversity. This key message is also important. We celebrate and invite our beautiful diversity in culture, heritage, languages, and religion, which is a cause of strength, including the tangible and intangible heritage of Africa's inland states and her diasporas. The African Union's Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, envisions an attainment of full gender parity. For example, the African Union envisions women occupying 50% of elected offices at state, regional, and local bodies, and 50% of managerial positions in government and private sector by women throughout all the regions of Africa and her diaspora. Advocacy, the 4th key message. We are a collective voice of faith, urging our nation's decision makers to end inequitable policies and lack of enforcement and lack of creation of policies at home and abroad. By changing policies, programs, and conditions that allow injustices like hunger and poverty to exist, we become transformative change agents of hope for and with our families, communities, and nations with partners like Bread for the World. Our lead partners are Bread for the World, World Council of Churches, the All Africa Conference of Churches, CITA, and the African Union. alongside a host of organizations and churches represented in this work. Pan-African Women of Faith, Pan-African Women's Ecumenical Empowerment Network, PAWE, seek to serve as a platform of academic study, spiritual reflection, and advocacy action with and for African women and women of African descent in all regions of the world. We stand for spirituality and faith engagement. We stand for academic study. We stand for action with and for African women and women of African descent in various regions of the world. Why and how Pan-African Women of Faith matter? Well, since the earliest biblical accounts in Genesis, African women and women of African descent have played a critical role in shaping the Judeo-Christian faith. From biblical women such as Hagar and Zipporah to the modern ecumenical movement, Pan-African women have and continue to be a pivotal presence in the churches and their communities. Therefore, Pan-African Women, PAWE, aims to gather and to make visible how the stories of Pan-African women, too often neglected in ecumenical and church history, can positively inform and nurture female leadership capacity development now and in the future. We remember the following examples of Pan-African women who did or who are doing this. The Queen of Sheba, a queen in the African country of Ethiopia, referenced in the Bible. Saint Monica, known as Monica of Hippo, was an early Christian saint and mother of Saint Augustine of Hippo from Egypt. There was also Mother Mathilda Taylor Beasley, Georgia's first African-American nun, who opened a secret school for African-American children at a time when teaching enslaved people of African descent was punishable by fine, whipping, and even death. We remember Evangelist Amanda Berry Smith, a Methodist and holiness evangelist missionary, and the founder of the Amanda Smith Orphanage, an industrial home for abandoned and destitute colored children. Of course, there was also Prophetess Kempa Vita, who was one of the first African women to fight against European dominance in Africa during the colonial period. Princess Laura Adarkor Kofi, known as Mother Kofi or Mother Laura, who was an activist and self-proclaimed prophet. Apostle Izain Ajima, founder of the Face of Joy International UK, an interdenominational ministry and charity based in Woolwich, Southeast London. And then today, there are persons like Reverend Dolores Dorcas Theka, the General Secretary for the Christian Council of Churches in Angola. And then there is the matriarch, Dr. Mercy Odini, known as, quote, the mother of African women theologies, educator, writer, mentor, poet, and women's advocate. And then there's Ms. Immaculée Elabadiza, a Rwandan American author and motivational speaker who speaks to her survival during the Rwanda genocide from a powerful faith lens. And then in the United States, we remember women like the Reverend Dr. Iva E. Carruthers, the General Secretary for the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference in the United States. And then, yes, younger women who are rising, Miss Carrie Cook, who serves as the Vice President at Communication Service for the Deaf, a multilateral and multinational social impact organization. She is representative of so many younger women coming along. And this is why we have and do matter as Pan-African Women of Faith. But we take steps as strong Pan-African women of faith to end hunger and poverty. We pray to end hunger and poverty. We visit our members of the U.S. Congress and discuss the importance of legislation to ending hunger and poverty. We share best practices and train on advocacy lessons from African countries, the United States, the Caribbean, Europe, Latin America, and also many other places in the world. And this is why and how we matter, Pan-African Women of Faith. We invite all to partner with us to make an impact. We invite our families. We invite churches. We invite communities. We invite theological institutions. We invite all countries, all people of goodwill to journey with us in action. We believe it takes all villages together to make a difference. This is why and how Pan-African women of faith matter in this same COFA movement.
Thank you again, Minister Jordan Cook and Minister Only Love Alston, the Rewriting the Narrative team of PAW and PAWIN. We thank God for you and for this gift that gives a clue about what this movement has been about since 2013. It is now my joy to bring on our first presenter, who will come and share the stories or the narrative relative to women, her stories, and the Pan-African Congresses. It's been my joy to work with Dr. Moyo before this time and over a few years, I would say, relative to the narratives concerning women. She is the predecessor to Reverend Nikki Ashwood in this very important role of community of women and men at the World Council of Churches, just as Dr. Brigaya Baum is as well in the earlier years. We are so blessed to have the lineage of that critically important desk that is represented in this space today. Dr. Moyo also is known otherwise to the global community. She is a trained mediator. She is a resource developer and a Viktor Frankl's logotherapy student with specialization in active listening techniques for mediation and trauma healing that acknowledge the importance of women's narratives. She is a member of the Community Voices in Peace and Pluralism in Africa, the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, and the board of Life and Peace Institute. She is the vice president of the AfriOS ILEAC Inc. board. She has researched and published widely on issues related to gender and religion. She is a founder of STREAM, a US registered NGO, non-governmental agency, or office, responding to sex trafficking through the accompaniment and mentorship of survivors. She is a former, again, World Council of Churches staff from 2007 to 2019. She earned her PhD in Human Sciences from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, with a focus in ethics, gender, and religion in 2009. I know her as a sister beloved, as one who's able to put scholarship into practice, and in turn, to take context into academic reflection. I was joined with her in terms of this presentation she will make. It was my joy to do some of the research relative to this presentation and to join her in being able to take this research and turn it into story for our time together. Dr. Moyo, you are welcome in this space. We honor you and thank God for you. Please, the floor is yours, Dr. Moyo.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and it is a great honor to be among you today. As I've already been introduced, I will just go straight into my few remarks with all protocol observed. Why is it that 70 years after the Watershed Manchester Conference, we are still singing this song, which was sung that time, that said, we are determined to be free. We want education. We want the right to earn a decent living, the right to express our thoughts and emotions, to adopt and create forms of beauty. Isn't it because we have maintained the Pan-African agenda with an exclusive elitist mindset? In my few thoughts, I want to contend that the exclusion of women, their stories and experiences from the core definitions of the Pan-African agenda has turned this agenda into what Mese Amba Odoyoye images as a bird trying to fly with one wing. Looking back, we know that there were women too at the Manchester as well as at the Tanzanian conference. Their stories need to be listened to and embraced so that their experiences continue to be part of what defines and strategically shapes the implementation of the Pan-African agenda. As Africans, our communitarian ethos that some of us refer to as Ubuntu prompts us to believe that inclusive unity is imperative to social, cultural, spiritual, economic, and political progress, so that the Pan-African agenda should indeed aim to unify, uplift, and inspire all people of Africa and of African descent. Since at its core, the Pan-Africanism is a belief that African people in all their commonalities and diversity, both on the continent and in the diaspora, share not merely a common history or her story, but also a common destiny that can be reached only when each member's potential is realized and affirmed as part of the communitarian whole. We know that many African countries have drawn their own Pan-African Agenda 2063 as a vision that their developmental program. So the Africa we want has become the blueprint and master plan to transform Africa into a global powerhouse of the future, but beginning now. My own country's Malawi Vision 2063 aims at becoming an inclusively wealthy and self-reliant nation, and has acknowledged the wisdom of including women and their experience as an intelligent strategy if this vision is to be realized. One of the gender agenda objectives in this vision reads as follows: by 2063, all forms of violence and discrimination, social, economic, and political, against women and girls should have been eliminated, and they would fully enjoy all their human rights and affirmed their dignity. This, I think, is really an important objective, as we've also heard from the past presenters, especially Professor Isabel Apao-Piri really mentioned a lot about this. So this objective that the whole Pan-African agenda should actually invest in wholeheartedly, I would argue. Having the privilege as well as the burden of listening to many intergenerational women's stories, one realizes that this objective has an implication on actually the imperative nature of mitigation of the impact that decades of gender inequality and injustice have caused. For my interest as you already heard, I'm a Victor Frankl logotherapy student. This has actually helped me to delve deep into the crucial role of trauma resilience and healing within the African agenda for justice, peace, and reconciliation. I want to emphasize the important role that storytelling plays in the process of community-based trauma healing practices. In 2019, the World Council of Churches invested in the development of a manual which was titled Healing Together, which you can access online. If you just type WCC Healing Together, it will come. This community and faith-based resource was developed in response to trauma, especially that which is caused by gender-based violence, after listening to so many stories of women who were carrying that pain with them, and it was not acknowledged and it was not even healed. It was not healed, it was not acknowledged. To develop this resource, I worked with Council of Churches in Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and South Sudan. And storytelling was embraced as an important contextual tool that sets the beginning of this crucial community-based journey together towards trauma resilience and healing. For we realized, and I think this is not a secret actually, that for most African women and men as well, the individual psychosocial responses feel intrusively individualistic, and they don't really embrace those, but rather they desire this community approach of healing together. And it also became clear that when we talk about the African people within the African continent and those in diaspora, we are talking about traumatized people, especially from historical and generational traumas of different levels and experiences. Within the African communitarian ethos, the telling of our stories, therefore, embraces our mutual vulnerability, that in context of where confidentiality is respected, it becomes a resource that has created safe spaces to build trusting relationships so as to effectively embark on healing journeys together. In telling our stories, we are saying that we are as vulnerable as our sister or our brothers are. We have a shared story that grounds our relationship. We are therefore interconnected and interdependent, and the hurt of one is our hurt. And therefore, we actually, by telling our stories, we also become, you know, what in trauma healing is referred to as wounded healers. We become accompaniers of each other towards the healing. African women have built their resilience through telling their stories. This has helped them to embrace their strengths and acknowledge their weaknesses, helping them to accompany and mentor each other so that each is able to reach their highest potential in the service of their community. Without the acknowledgement of our traumatic stories, we carry our acknowledged and unhealed hurts that end up making us serve from the insecurities of our woundedness. Thus, we end up hurting others and become vulnerable to being exploited. If we are serious about being a Pan-African community that is inclusively wealthy and self-reliant, then let's create the space for healing of our traumatic memories, and embracing our stories is a great starting point of this, our journey together. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Dr. Moyo, thank you very much for this intervention. It has reminded us of the journey that has come and the journey that is yet ahead relative to inclusive community, celebrating the voices of women in the Manchester journey, the Pan-African Congress's journey, as well as accompanying journeys that you have spoken to in this moment. Certainly, women have always been there and will be there and are there. Thank you so much for your presentation. We are going to take a very, very brief 5-minute break, just a 5-minute break. Keep your computers on, have your coffee, have your tea, and then we come back together to hear our keynote presenter from Dr. Brigaya Bam. We are honored to have her with us as well as a matriarch and certainly an iconic leader in the global space and in the country of South Africa. You certainly don't want to miss Dr. Brigaya Bam, who will come to us after the 5-minute break. Welcome back. We hope you had a nice coffee, tea break, or whatever you needed to do during that brief break. We will now move toward the latter half of our time together. We begin again thanking those who have come prior to this moment on this morning for their fine presentations and helping us to tell her stories relative to the Pan-African Congresses, a Pan-African Renaissance agenda, and always tribute to the ancestors who have come before us. We thank God for you, and we thank God for the honor of following our ancestors in this moment and going forward. Certainly, we are a Sankofa generation that is able to look back, look in the moment, and also envision the future. With that being said, we are very honored today to have our keynote presenter, Dr. Brigaya Bam. Before Dr. Bam comes on, I want to refer you to the chat. We have provided names of scholars, researchers, as well as names that will tell you more about the particular her stories relative to the Pan-African Congresses. Please feel free to look them up online and to learn more about her stories and the Pan-African Congresses. Again, without further ado, it is my great joy and honor to introduce to you another iconic figure in South Africa, but also in the global space. We introduce to you now Dr. Brigaya Bam. Dr. Brigaya Bam is the former General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches. She is also one with a legacy in many spaces, not just in the ecumenical space. She was born in the former Transkei in the Eastern Cape. And although Dr. Bam trained and worked as a teacher, she received further training in South Africa and abroad in the global space, in the fields of social work, communication, and management. She is a qualified social worker with a postgraduate degree from the University of Chicago in the United States. She has held various posts throughout the world. She was the Africa Regional Secretary and the coordinator of the Women's Workers Program for the International Food and Allied Workers Association based in Geneva, Switzerland. She has coordinated the World Young Men's Christian Association's International Training Institute and program, as well as its affiliate, the Development for Human Rights. She was also the Executive Program Secretary for the Women's Department of the World Council of Churches. Between 1997 and 98, Dr. Bam, as I referred earlier, served as the General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches from 1994 to 1999. In South Africa, she was a founding member of the Women's Development Foundation and became the foundation's president in 1998. She has been a board member of the Matla Trust, as well as the South African Broadcasting Corporation. Since 1999, Dr. Bam has become a familiar personality to South Africans as the chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa, contributing her accumulated experience to the well-managed electoral process for which South Africa has become known. Yes, it was Dr. Bam who was instrumental in the transition of independence of South Africa that became a nation for majority voting and majority rights. She was a key leader in ensuring those processes. Her stealing leadership and wise counsel has been seen throughout South Africa through many difficult times. The President's Office of South Africa says that Dr. Bam is a great asset to South Africa and the legacy therein. In the space relative to the AAD and Manchester Conference, we are honored that Dr. Bam is a member of the patrons who support this wonderful work. She also has been instrumental in mobilizing resources so that this conference could be made possible. Dr. Bam, in this moment, we thank you for your legacy. We thank you for your ongoing support of this moment and this movement. And I personally want to say to you, thank you for being a mentor to me in my journey as well. Dr. Bam, it is our honor, it is our joy to welcome you as our keynote presenter for this time together. After Dr. Bam comes, we'll have 3 respondents from the global space to give their responses to what Dr. Bam has to share with us on today. Dr. Bam, you are most welcome. God bless you. Dr. Bam, I think your microphone is not open. Thank you so much. And if you could also turn on your camera so we can see you as well, that would be great. If not, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay.
And there she is. Welcome, Dr. Bam.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I greet you. I've been thinking how best to handle this exciting afternoon for all of us. But I would like to greet you and probably with your permission, say to you, I am representing not only myself, but many generations of your mothers and your grandmothers. And so many things I say will not necessarily be very relevant today. But I would like to say good afternoon, because for us in this part of the world, in South Africa, it is in the afternoon. I'm sure I am one of the few delegates who are here who was 12 years old, in fact, at the end of the Second World War. And many of us at the time, my father was a soldier, my uncle had been a soldier, and my grandfather's brother also had been a soldier. And we had great expectations when they returned in terms of the compensations that would come with that. But instead of us getting that with our high hopes, we were really crushed by the apartheid system, and it crushed our souls. but it is then a privilege that I am now here to share with you. Permit me, especially those of you who are scholars, permit me to use a method of storytelling and also to take from my tradition of an oral tradition. I am not going to read my notes line by line. That will take too long. And so if you permit me to simply speak and share, maybe in a formal way, at times I will refer to my script. And I want to assure you, when the conference is over, everybody will edit it. Its length is long, of course, as to be expected of someone who has been living for too long. You can very well understand that, and we would be glad to share it at an appropriate time. I thought, as I was trying to write, that I probably will honor my mother as well on this occasion, and because I was thinking of all our mothers and grandmothers who have been on this long road. And I thought the best way of doing that is to talk about my own mother, who was a daughter of a Moravian pastor, my grandfather called Peter Maswi. And Mama read every day this text. And the Moravians, had this text printed. And I realize now that it is the 20 something year. I'm trying to look at my notes to see where I find that, the notes of the 92 years that they have been writing this 200 and I can't read my own notes, at 90, when they have been making this available. And many of us, including myself in my home, when we could read, we started to read this. And it was very, very exciting to us to be able to do that. And I thought I'll share with you, because I said it's memory of my mother, that they've got two types of text. They chose a text for the year, which was a 2021 text. And this text for the year is called "Be Merciful Just as Your Father is Merciful." And it's in Luke 6:36. And I just thought I will do that just to have something I could share from the old days, the good old days of our parents who were teaching us. But I want to take an opportunity a little bit and congratulate the organizers of this conference. That is such a remarkable achievement for the global conference to be planned at a time that is such a difficult time for us. For many decades, the coronavirus also is something that has given us a lot of fear. And I would like to mention and put on record my own gratitude and appreciation with great pride of the work that has been done by Angelica Water-Smith and Reverend Frank Chikane and their super efficient team. And indeed, you have made us proud. Thanks to the Holy Spirit, without the service, dedicated people, the movement, the ecumenical movement, would not become, because people are in it. So it can be an organization that is depersonalized and institutionalized. And the energy of this organization is exactly what you are saying. And I quote, it says, "The energy of the ecumenical movement has always been the creative visions, solemn covenants, courageous engagements, and fervent prayers of countless women and men churches and groups." And this is a quotation that really, I think, for them, as they were working and planning and praying day after day, that has been the spirit of and I really say it's been an honor to watch it, and the detail of it, the detail that goes with this kind of planning has been very, very impressive, really, to us who are watching it. But I also want to talk about, and probably make a reference a little bit to this conference that the most important thing for us is that we should work in a tireless manner on this decolon project, because it's a lifetime project for us to transform our institution. It is also a lifetime project for many of us to heal what has gone on in our lives, our own lives, and the lives of our own parents and our grandparents, and the lives of the ancestors. And I think this is something that comes through. I think one of the persons mentioned it, that becomes very, very important for us to do. Now, the Black people in the world will always be in a special, difficult position, because I just want to say that when we commemorate this, we are commemorating a very important history in Manchester, which it laid the foundation for the possibility for us to be here today and to talk of the united worlds of the African continent. The 75th anniversary of the Pan-African Congress in Manchester reminds us of the commitment of the African leaders and intellectuals all over the Black world to demand equal economic opportunity, decolonization, and the end of economic exploitation of Africa by the colonial world. There is a lot written on this, but I think it's always important for us to remind ourselves about all that. Now, the African agenda at the heart of the international relations and decolonial agenda, despite the long traditions of Black world connected histories, these Pan-African Congresses, which spearheaded by Barrister Henry Silver Williams in 1900, give a concrete meaning to the African unity all over the world. It is fair to believe that this connection and movement by all African peoples require that we reflect and check ourselves against blind spots and possibilities, especially for African women all over the Black world. And we observe consistency, invisibilities of the contributions of African women in the idea of African connected world, yet being the center of African existence. Now, the Pan-Africanism had a program, and the greatest program of it was, of course, as we all know, the political liberation of Africa. And by Africa, in this case, we talk about all those whose ancestors have their bones in this part of the continent. And the Africans we talk about of diaspora are all over the world. And so we will always have a common history, a common purpose of the peoples of Africa and the African diaspora, and the notion that their destinies are the foundations of I'm lost in my script. I was reading on that foundations. Yes. Okay, I'm reading the script. That's why I was trying to avoid reading it. In addition, many would highlight the importance of the liberation and advancement of the entire African diaspora. Such perspective might be traced back to ancient times, but Pan-Africanist thought and action is principally connected with and provoked by the modern dispersal of Africans resulting from the trafficking of captives across the Atlantic to the Americas, as well as elsewhere, from the end of the 15th century to the close of the 19th century. And so this history is an important history, and this history is known by very many people. But I'd like then to move a little bit from this kind of history that we are referring to and look perhaps into where we are today. And I will ask for your permission that I will simply enter in this part of discussion in a conversational style and not try to follow my script very closely. I want to say that one of the most important things that the women have done in all these years, long before 76 years, was for them to pray. The women were praying in their organizations, they were praying in their homes, and they were praying everywhere. And I think these prayers that they have done were really the prayers that were deep. And in some cases, these prayers indeed produced the miracles that we don't know. And I think that this is one of the most important things that today the women should continue this discipline. And I'm excited that other people are beginning to take it. Women were evangelists, and women were establishing churches, and women were preaching in their own right, going to communities. And so this is a history that is important. And this is a history that for all of us, we must carry through and carry it through. Many people have already mentioned a number of things that has happened in these last many years. I must say that to see the development of all this has been the most exciting thing in my own life, because when I attended the first meeting, it was in 1963. This was the launch of the All Africa Conference of Churches. An amazing experience for me at the time. I was a youth participant and a delegate of the All Africa Conference of Churches at the time. And the woman who organized this came from the World Council of Churches, and her name was Dr. Madeleine Barrault. And Madeleine Barrault had this idea that the only way of making sure that women participate in the meetings that are organized by the World Council of Churches is to plan meetings prior to the conference. I'm not sure if this was the same tradition that you are following. And then when the meeting does start with, at that time, the delegations that were virtually 99% all male, with your apologies to the young women, those were the difficult times. But anyway, they happened. But the women would be sneaked into these meetings so that at least they can listen, and they can come even as observers because they were not delegates. That shows you where we have been. But times have changed, that today we are able to celebrate our own bishops. Today we are able to celebrate the women in leadership in all positions of the church. And that today we are able to celebrate the women being baptized like others in a normal pond. And that is our history of many things. There has been a reference in the discussion on the issue of racism and sexism. And the World Council of Churches took care of this and realized that there was no way in which we can talk about racism when in fact the attitudes and all the structures made us as women, but also as Blacks, very inferior. And so the program to combat racism, which was also been referred to, became a very important program for us to be able also to facilitate in that kind of program. I've already talked a little bit about the long debate of many years on the ordination of women, document after document. Apparently, this subject came up already in the early days of the World Council of Churches, in the early assemblies where there were women. Even before there was World Council of Churches, the records show that women were pleading in 1927, Faith and Order Mission, of their recognition and ordination. I tell this in a story form because they are encouraging stories that every phase and every century will always bring the things that become a challenge, which now many people take for granted. But now there is really a serious problem in the world in which we live. And that women are still facing, in spite of the successes we have made, they are facing many problems. And the racism hasn't left us. And so the racism hasn't left women either. And for women are still, though we have the laws now, and also in some situations, an embarrassment, but the socio-economic challenges have become key. The poverty of the women is a concern to us as women of the church. And there is one of the challenges today. I am not implying that all other issues that we have been handling over the years, many of us, have become unimportant. I am not implying that at all. But I think that there is a shift, is that as long as the women of the world, who are the mothers with their children, are living in poverty, even our argument of feminism, even our arguments of inclusion, even all the other concerns that we talk about, that are education, there's a lot related, because people who are poor can't afford to send their children to school. And so this is the biggest challenge to what I call the feminists of today, that the feminists of today will be forced, that the agenda is made to be very, very broad, because the agenda of justice, the agenda of us, even in our own continent, in Africa, where we still have a lot of old, I refer to them as very old traditional problems that women were facing, on forced marriages, on right to citizenship, on of course, the sexual and gender-based violence, which in South Africa and other countries has become the greatest challenge of our time. The problems of women having to be challenged on issues of sexual and reproductive rights by World Health, economic, and which I have already mentioned on a broader form, and employment issues of women, the training of women, but also in the African continent for now, and I am hoping that for others it's becoming less, the problem of the schooling. The statistics are showing that many women don't get an opportunity this day in the world, 2021, to go to school. Now, this makes it that our agenda has got to change. How can that happen this day and age, that with spite of the international organizations that speak for these things, the UNICEF and others? So let's talk a little bit and perhaps continue the story to say, what can we do and how do we do it? I think the first thing, which you are already doing, and I want to congratulate this method and encourage it, of the dialogue and the telling of the story. I think people are a little bit tired of lectures. People are a little bit tired of being lectured to about their oppression and about the things they feel. And I think there is a new way, which for us, for me, especially my generation, and that is the intergenerational approach. We have no choice. We cannot continue to do our work of any way that we are doing studies or we are looking at issues or it's a workshop or a seminar. We have done hundreds and hundreds of those in these 76 years. Is that inclusion of youth and the young women of the world is an absolute necessity. And then it is important that we take on ourselves to create what I refer to as the creators with the new moral code of the world. Use an expression in South Africa of Ubuntu. Ubuntu broader, it's really you put the person as the most important person. And around that, then the issues that arise of despising people, discriminating them, depriving them, becomes for us a renewed vision. I think I should use that word, because people have always been, that this becomes a code for us. It's how do we begin it, that issues of justice. I am not implying to young women who always say to me, now that you all got the positions that you have as a woman, you are saying we must abandon feminism and the issues of representation in committees and things like that. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm talking about what is facing us as women, that we need to put our weight. And then we have, of course, the environmental issues that are going to force the world to change. And so these global issues have become our issues, if I may use the word, as feminists, especially those feminists who are in our space on the things that matter most. I cannot talk long enough about the food security. I cannot talk enough about the Green Revolution. And we have to say in our own towns, and in the African continent, we have to say in my own country and remind people that the women, when I grew up also as a young woman in my own home, women were managing the food. Women were planting, because our Black men were called to go and work in the mines as cheap labor. And so women were very active in the production of food. And the women were the ones who would weed the maize and the beans and the pumpkins. I grew up in that environment where women would be doing this work all the time. They didn't have much of a choice. And what we really need to, which is very difficult, is how do we begin to introduce this value to the younger people in general, and the younger women in particular, because the mothers, unfortunately, will always have a responsibility, no matter what, of caring for the young people and of caring for the children. So the future we are talking about says to us many problems that we are facing will not be resolved by the governments only. And this is a new challenge to us. Christianity has, in some measure, prevented some things, on culture and tradition, representing them. But when we still today have the trafficking of young women, we still have today women who have to be the brides. It's unbelievable. And I think that the Christianity as we know it is probably need to think, what is it where we have failed? That at this day and age, all those traditional things are still done in spite of everything else. And I want to say to us, the history, and I want to quote that because I found that it's a useful one for all of us. It says, history outside the code of traditions of the church tell us, therefore, that the ecumenical movement, turned inside out, must lead to an ecumenical convergence as we strive to be instrumental to God's mission in the mission of the world. And that means to us today is the concerns of justice. The concerns of justice are the ones that are calling us. And the concerns of justice in its broadest form are saying that our agendas must change. And it is that challenge that says our spirituality, which I so much, I believe in it, that there is something called women's spirituality. And I think that the scholars and those who speak with experience must begin to explore this, because many of us, that it is, they say that it is one of the oldest, it's in fact one of the oldest things that have existed on earth, and that is the spirituality of the women. And this has to come to the world. And I was excited to see that in this conference that is starting tomorrow, this subject is being raised again of what I call the African spirituality. And I want to claim, with your support of many theologians, that the women have been on that road for a very long time. And what made the women to be committed to prayer, what made the women to be committed to nurturing other people, and what made the women to be caring for people is really more than just the psychic of motherhood, but it is also this base, spiritual base. And so as we all struggle, especially for you, the younger women of the future, some of us will not be there, to keep in mind that we as women in our situation of fighting for our own recognition, that we embrace humanity, that justice becomes the real word, the real concept, and that the caring of other human beings becomes the core of our existence, because the world in which we live has become very unequal. And through no choice of our own as women, we have become part of this unequal world, because many of us are privileged, many of us are middle class, many of us have had opportunities for education. And so though we are still deprived on other things, we are also belonging to the other class. We will never be in a society that is classless. We will never be in a society in the world that doesn't have people who are rich. But we cannot justify the society of today and the society of the future. And I am excited, like you are, about the revolution, the fourth revolution on technology. I think it has a lot to offer the world, but because of my generation, I am nervous when I think of the hundreds and hundreds of women. Where will they be in the new world of the fourth revolution? Will they be prepared? Will be absorbed by it? Will there be space for us? Will there be space for my great-grandchildren in that new world of that? And so those are some of the things I think we can begin to talk about in our world. And I also want to acknowledge, though I didn't have it in my notes, many women in Africa and abroad who really have been in these 76 years doing amazing things. In my script, you will see when you read it, some of them are named, these women, they are named by name. But I just want to tell you one last story to say, when I went to the United States for the first time, which was only in 1967, when I went, because after joining the World Council of Churches, in fact, my first invitation when I arrived in Geneva in 1967, September, came from Church Women United. This was a very strong movement in the United States. And I wanted to meet Dorothy Height. I wanted to meet Dorothy Height, and surely I met her. And the inspiration, you know, I had. And then when I went and visited other countries, and a leader who we had recruited the women called Annie Giage, which some of you might know, she was a Ghanaian. And these women were really there as people we looked up to. And these were great days that we need to continue to inspire each other and be proud of each other. And I owe so much to Mercy Odioye. Mercy Odioye is one of those women who had an amazing vision. I just need to say in passing, Mercy came to join, we came to work at World Council of Churches the same month and the same day. And there are stories we can tell about that because people thought we are all going to be secretaries somewhere. The organization itself, I want people to know, we're shocked that you have 2 Black women who are coming to work as program directors. And Mercy's vision and Mercy's establishment, finally, after we had established the circle, that we needed also to be able to speak theologically and to say the Mercy's vision of us, and it was of third world theologians coming together to think and write. And so we have many of those stories, and you will find a lot of these stories in my script. And I couldn't take all of them to say. And thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. It is indeed an amazing privilege for me that I could still come to a meeting of this nature, and you have honored me by inviting me, though I am a retired person and like of them, facing aging with all its challenges and joys. Thank you very much.
Dr. Bam, we are simply, I must say to some extent, overwhelmed with your legacy and your willingness to join us and to go so deeply into your journey to share with us today. We cannot thank you enough. We are looking forward to looking at the manuscript, but please know we're delighted to hear your voice and to see your face and to know that God is still with you, blessing you to even in this moment to speak to the challenges that we have had historically and in this moment and even going forward. We just thank you so much for taking time to be with us. Dr. Bam, we know you could say even more. You've said so much already. But I just want to echo quickly what you said about what we need to do now, because this will contribute to the declaration that will come as a result of this conference. These words about women's spirituality, acknowledging our mothers, the ancestors, those who come before us, and even to be vulnerable to share about your mother. And then the issues around the fourth industrial revolution, around technology, and making sure no one is left behind. And then the issues around food security and the environment. And dare we also mention climate change, which is on the agenda for this week. And that the matter of spirituality, yes, women's spirituality, but spirituality matters generally speaking as well. And then we must embrace the different visions that have come together. And to recognize the movements that also Dr. Firi also mentioned that have come in the ecumenical history. You and Dr. Mercy Odioye, being there in 1967, being there before so many things now that so many women accept as rights and not just privilege, but as rights to their human dignity. And then this whole question of where do we go from here, and to be critical of what has not happened yet. What is it the churches need to do now? And more than that, what do we as women of Africa and African descent need to say and to do to make sure that those questions are asked critically? But also, as some of the younger women said to us in our annual conference at Powing last year, to do so with radical love. What does it mean to live in that tension as well in this moment? These are a few of the points that you made toward the end around us to consider going forward. We take them very seriously, just as we've heard all the presentations very seriously today, that will be considered as we put together the declaration of where we go after the conferencing when it ends on next week. Thank you again, Dr. Baum. We honor and you honor us by being with us. Now we have 3 respondents to you. And I must say, I'm glad I'm not in their chair. I'm glad I'm just a moderator in the moment. But we had 3 distinguished respondents today. One who has been mentioned already earlier in the comments of what predates Pauline and PAW, and that is the Sisters Movement. And that was led by our own Marilia Shula, who is a part of Pauline and PAW. We are so honored. She, in her vision at that time, had this vision of sisterhood, of women who were not of Anglo identity, who were sisters, women who also had these other isms, if you will, attached to social identity, but knew that they were children of God. And that was Marilia Schuler, and I honor her in this moment. She will be our first respondent. I could say more about her. She's a leader in Brazil. She's a member of the international team for this conferencing for the entire week. She has brought the Latin American perspective to the conferencing this week. She has continued in the great legacy she brought to the World Council of Churches when I was a young adult back in the movement, and I honor her too for impact that she's had on my life, just as Dr. Bam has. After Marilia comes to us, then I would be honored to bring on our second speaker to put her on notice, and that would be Dr. Evie Vernon, who comes to us from England, from the UK, United Kingdom. She will be our second speaker. I'll tell you more after Marilia comes or Ms. Shula comes. And then our third respondent will be the Reverend Dion Balsia, who really comes as a transnational. She is of a Caribbean heritage, but she's living in the United States, but she's also the United Nations chaplain in New York City. I'll say more about their identities after Ms. Schuler comes to give her response. Marilia, Ms. Schuler, my dear sister, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Angelique. I want to say hello to Brigalia. It is an honor to meet you again, even if I am in Brazil and you are in South Africa. I had the honor to serve in the World Council of Churches in the program to combat racism that Brigalia had mentioned to us. And I had the honor also to follow the footsteps of Jean Sendab, that was the first program executive of the Women and the Racism program. At that time, I also had the great opportunity to serve together with my colleague Barney Pitiana, Dr. Barney Pitiana, that was the director of the program to combat racism at that time. So to honor all these persons that, sorry, excuse me for the emotion, it's very important to me because they were friends, brothers, sisters, and I learned so much, and I try to follow in my work and my service on their footsteps. So I feel honored and to be here and humbled by this invitation to participate. And Angelique is right, is a very great challenge to respond to Dr. Brigalia Bam. But I made plenty of notes, but I guess I will not go through all of them. But I wanted to honor our mothers and grandmothers just as Brigelia very well started her presentation. My gratitude, our gratitude as women of African descent in the diaspora, we would not be here today if it wasn't for our mothers and grandmothers, our ancestors, and all the women and men that inspired us in our ministries and our services. So I wanted to respond to that as it echoes in my heart, and I'm sure as it echoes in the heart of many of the women and men that are listening to us. And honoring the storytelling that Dr. Brigelia so much emphasized, and that relates to our mothers and grandmothers. I think the Sisters Network at the time, that sisters means sisters in the struggle to eliminate racism and sexism, was also built upon the storytelling. We have brought together at the time African descent women from the Americas, from Latin America, from North America, but we also brought together with us Dalit women from India and indigenous women from Asia and Latin America. And we were all gathered together from this focus of telling our story. And in telling our story and sharing, we were responding to many of the issues that Dr. Brigelia had highlighted. And I'm going to mention a few because they are at the heart of the work women of African descent continue doing in Brazil and in Latin America, in different parts of the world. Matters related to our spirituality, how we understand ourselves as daughters and of God, and how God has been in our lives, and how we interpret the Bible, how we read the Bible from our own eyes as women of African descent. But also in that exercise, highlighting matters as the issues of inequalities, the issues of poverty, and I mentioned particularly in those times of coronavirus pandemic in Brazil, never before it became so clear the inequality that we live in our country, as far as racism and the situation of people of African descent, not only women, but people of African descent. The question of decolonization, and on the matter of decolonial perspective and approach, I wanted to emphasize the importance of so many African descent women in the Americas, but particularly in Latin America, like Maricel Mena Lopes, like Silvia Regina de Lima e Silva, like Betty Ruth Lozano Lerma, and I could bring so many other names of sisters that have journeyed together with us, in which they try also to reflect theologically. They show the situation of African descent people in the Americas, and the issue of racism, and how our common history in terms of slave trade and what the impact of slavery in our countries, and how our situation today is still rooted in this history of slavery and slave trade. For example, Dr. Maricel, she will participate in the AAD conference as well. She has been working on the question of decolonizing, because our theological education in Latin America, in many countries, is still based on on a kind of premise that needs to be critiqued and needs to be moved forward. And also the concerns for women's spirituality and how it constitutes us. Definitely, as women of African descent in our ministries, we have been doing that because we have a very strong focus on spirituality. In our work as African descent women in Latin America, the issue of racism, the issue of sexism, the critique of the structures, and the situation of Black women and the underprivilege of Black women have been a very strong emphasized issues for us. So we understand how crucial for us is the situation, the economic challenges we face, the situation of poverty, as I mentioned. Also, how crucial is matters of inclusion in education. That is still one of the greatest challenges we face here in Brazil. But another element that Dr. Brigalia Ben has mentioned is the question of justice. And yes, it is crucial for us to discuss gender-based violence and feminicide. Those are very crucial elements. The numbers of women, African descent women and women in general that have been affected by feminicide in Brazil is growing greater. The matters of sexual and reproductive rights are also very crucial for us. The training of women, the opportunity to go to school of young girls in general, but particularly young girls of African descent, it remains a very, very strong challenge for us. And obviously, the question of inclusion of youth. I don't know how many of you know, but I think one of the crucial matters in terms of youth in our country is particularly the issue of that we in Brazil, in the movements, we call the genocide of African descent young men, that many are between 18 and 24. That is, the violence that they suffer is one of the primary causes of death of young people in Brazil. So this is a crucial issue for us as well. And obviously the matter of food security that Dr. Brigalia Ben mentioned. Angelique, please, you stop me when my 10 minutes is over, okay? Please let me know.
You're coming to that last minute. Sorry for that, my dear.
No problem, dear, no problem. So I will wrap up. I will wrap up. As I was mentioning, the question of food security is still a very crucial aspect for us. And I'm speaking particularly to Brazil. That is the seller of grains, produce, and export in the country. Is one of, if I'm not mistaken, the second or maybe the third producer of food in the world. But yet, the African descent population in Brazil during this pandemic has suffered a great deal of no food on their table. So the matter of racism, the racial inequality, the economic situation, and how it impacts the African descent population, but how it impacts particularly women of African descent in Brazil, remains a crucial issue for us here. So I think I could go on, but I thank you very much Dr. Brigalia, for all the input and very important elements you have highlighted. And I wanted to thank you and thank Angelique and all the sisters that are listening, participating in this session. And may God, Father and Mother of all of us, bless us today and every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maralia. Your legacy goes before us as well. Thank you for all you did during those days of the program to combat racism, what you have been doing in Brazil and Latin America, and what you still bless all of us with in what you're doing now. Thank you very much. Now it is my joy to bring on two more speakers. Our time is drawing nigh, so we are going to be mindful of time as well. We want to bring on now Dr. Evie Vernon. Dr. Vernon is a scholar who lives in the UK. She's been a part of Pan-African Women's Ecumenical Empowerment Network, Pan-African Women of Faith, together over these years. But she is known throughout the UK for her scholarly engagements and her critical reflections around scripture, as well as contextual theology. Dr. Vernon, please, the floor is yours for these next few moments. And then of course, Reverend Bossier, you will be following after just a quick moment of introduction. Dr. Vernon, the floor is yours. You may want to ensure your microphone is on.
Okay. Okay, here I am. Okay. Okay, there we go. And Angelique, you're muted. Okay, what a joy and a privilege to be here with you all. And yeah, I feel emotional. I'm taken back to January 1979, when the World Council of Churches Central Committee happened in Kingston, Jamaica, at the University of the West Indies. And we who were young theological students at the time were privileged to act as stewards. And that set us on a theological path from which we have not departed, I think. We were enthused, we were overjoyed. There was the Reverend Dr. Philip Potter, that giant of a man from Dominica, who was the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, and who, you know, fostered and encouraged the program to combat racism. And we heard about that. There came Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a little man with fire. And we had, I will never forget being in the chapel and seeing and hearing Mercy Amber Odoyoye preaching. And she brought in Anansi, the West African spider. And all of these, and reading from Dr. Brigalia Ban, all of these inspired us to go forward and to have confidence that the stories of who we were mattered and were important, that the stories of our grandmothers, of the women who served, of the men who cut the cane, all of these people matter. These are the theologians on whom we built. We tried to explain their theologies and put them across to the rest of the world. And we still sit at your feet. I think for today, as I'm filled with emotion, and there's a lot to say. I am Jamaican, yes, I'm living in the UK. And so many of those issues that have been raised by my sisters today are of relevance. I will just passingly mention, you know, in this either the fifth or the sixth wealthiest economy in the world. People are on the street, homeless, dying of cold. You know, one died not far from Parliament about 2 years ago. The pandemic has exposed the inherent racism within the system because disproportionately people of, what shall we say? I don't like to use the word non-white, but people of African and other nationality and other ethnic backgrounds, yeah, died disproportionately in the COVID epidemic. And most crucially, the nurses and the doctors were decimated, okay, people of color. In terms of femicide and race and, you know, sexism in this wonderful country, the formerly United Kingdom, not very united right now, we've had an alarming rise in pressure about the sexism within the police force, as a serving police officer has just been convicted of raping and murdering a woman. And as it has turned out, you know, they knew about his propensities long in advance. And yet, the people who are in charge, we've had 3 home secretaries who have been women in succession, and they don't seem to care. And they say, well, they really didn't know this was going on. Now, who doesn't know that the police force is sexist? But what can I tell you? Anyway, leaving that aside, I feel moved to share with you, there is a book that has just been launched, Ecumenical Encounters with Desmond Tutu, for the 100th birthday of the Archbishop. Because as a Jamaican, South Africa is a wellspring of, what shall I say, of spiritual energy for us. And Dr. Ban, I salute you. And I will share this article that I was invited to put in as part of this book, yeah? And it's called A Statement from the Mother of Simon of Cyrene. In the Holy Land of Soweto, the nurturing place of many witnesses to freedom, including Desmond and Leah Tutu, Nelson and Winnie Mandela, and my beloved friends George and Gladys Walkup, stands the Hector Peterson Museum, a memorial to one of the children and young people shot by the security forces during the Soweto student uprising on June 16, 1976. The world cannot forget the courage of the young people reflected in Sam Nazimba's photograph of 3 young people, 12-year-old Hector, his sister Antoinette Sitole, and Mumbisa Makubo, who picked up and carried the dying Hector. Forgive me, South Africans, for my pronunciation. This story of Soweto is one that connects to the universal stories of bravery and compassion that cause us to be more than we can be. Mumbisa's mother, Nambwelo Makubo, also lost her son on that day. He was not killed that day, but eventually had to take refuge overseas. Nambwelo died in 2004, not knowing where her son was. Her words from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are etched on the memorial at the museum. I said, according to my culture, Umbwesa is not a hero. He just did what was natural, because we are our brother's keepers, according to our culture. He just saw Hector falling down. It would have been a scandal for no one to pick up Hector Peterson from the ground. As far as we are concerned, he was never a hero for picking up Hector Peterson. The Gospels name Simon, a man of Cyrene in what we now call Libya, as a passerby compelled to carry Jesus's cross. We know from Mark 15, he must have had a mother, and her spirit may well have resonated with that of Nambwelo, the other African mother, and with every mother who has lost a child to injustice. My son is not a hero. He saw you fall and stepped forward. The soldiers seized upon his pity. You carry it then. He was compelled, not by their swords, but by his heart of compassion. From my womb, he had learned to reach out to each one as family. To ignore your pain would have been the ultimate scandal. So as your brother, he carried the cross on which you would offer up your body, bowed and broken for us all. No hero, but an acolyte in the celebration of life beyond the cross. Amen.
Dr. Vernon, thank you so much for your response. We are grateful both to you and Madali Yeshua, Ms. Shula. Thank you. We now move quickly to Reverend Dion Bossier, who is the chaplain with the United Nations based in New York. She's been a part of this movement of Pauline and Pan-African women of faith. She is a sister beloved, caring not only for the prophetic, but the priestly and also the pastoral needs relative to God's people in the global policy space. She brings a breadth of global experience and scholarship to this occasion. We now are pleased to turn over the floor to the Reverend Dion Bossier for these closing remarks, and then we'll go into any questions that may be in the chat or any observations. Please put them in the chat at this time, because we are coming to the close of our time together. We would appreciate that. Reverend Bossier, the floor is yours.
I hope and pray that you can hear me. What a deep joy and an honor it is to be represented amongst you, to feel like I am sitting around my grandmother's table and hearing the stories and listening to the griots. And so protocol has already been established, but I must give gratitude. It is an honor even to meet you virtually, Dr. Bam. Such a gift and a blessing to even be able to respond on the panel of these two amazing women that I have the privilege of being on. And I wanted to also thank again, Pauline, and of course, the World Council of Churches, but also to the two co-conveners, to you, Dr. Walker-Smith, and of course, to you, Reverend Chikane, for really holding up what has happened in the Manchester Conference, but also creating and crafting space for us to be here even now. And of course, for our South African hosts, just grateful to the elders and mothers and teachers, the grandmothers, sisters, beloved siblings in the struggle for liberation, and honoring, as we honor the griots, the storytellers, those from the Sisters Movement, as well, those who are still pressing to end racism, sexism, and the liberation of all humanity. I wanted to, there's so much, like so many of my colleagues and respondents have said, so much, Dr. Bam, that you said that we want to be able to respond to. And I just want to be able to lift. You said something that stuck with me, and I think it will be something that I will be carrying with me in spirit throughout the time, is you said this is a lifetime project to heal what has gone on in our lives and the lives of our parents and grandparents and our ancestors. And this really just echoed even what Dr. Moyo was saying before, the common history and common destiny that we have, and that storytelling at the center of it, where we're centering our stories, those stories of African and African diasporic people, must be at the core. You also mentioned, of course, the Pan-African agenda, which required us to reflect and check ourselves and to observe, you said, the inconsistencies and the invisibilities of women and their stories in the movement. You used, again, this phrase, and it really, when you defined African for you, you said, I mean all those that have their bones in this part of the world. that is so significant for me, being transnational and of course the second generation Caribbean American. And so for me, this notion of growing up and sort of not feeling welcome in one space or another, by you sort of making sure to define that, what I mean by African, it opens, I think, ourselves up to understand not only history and its context, but, well, as you said, like where we are going today. The other thing I wanted to lift what you said, and I think to respond to, is this notion of women, the women that are praying. The women, you said, prayer is at the core, women praying in our organizations, in our homes, and that these prayers produce the miracles. And so that women shouldn't stop doing what we're doing today. For me, of course, your issue that you brought up around seeing women in leadership within the church, ordination, still that is not available in some mainline denominations, particularly in the Catholic tradition, but yet the women who are doing the heavy lifting in all of them. And so, you know, your issue of the agenda of justice that you mentioned, which is including educational access for girls, poverty as a main challenge, and to the notion of feminists today. I want to speak to that just for a moment, just because, as you mentioned, intergenerational approach, and you're talking about inclusion. I actually really think, I think what you have said is so key and helps us to kind of look into it. You used Ubuntu, which we use all the time in this work, because I am, because we are, and not acknowledging those who have come before us and laid the foundation does not allow us to see where we are going and the mistakes that have been made, learning from, growing from, and expanding. So I would like to say that this issue of inclusion has to be revisited as well. You talked about our agenda must change, and our spirituality, women who has been doing women's spirituality for so long. And of course, this quote, of course, that you said, God's mission is the mission of the world, the concerns of justice, so that justice has to be on the agenda. And of course, lifting those griots who have come before us, really helping with African spirituality and Africans in the diaspora, and those of us who are in the Americas also give thanks, deep gratitude to those like Dr. Mercy Odeoye and to Dorothy Height, as you've mentioned. And so I want to also lift one of our ancestors who have been a part of that movement, Audre Lorde, who says revolution is not a one-time event. And so I think what you are talking about, which is this notion of including justice in the agenda, I think that we can't have an agenda if we're not using justice, but also to expand what we understand to be inclusion. I think the core issues that you have mentioned has been on the agenda since Manchester, and this notion and the question that even Dr. Moyo raised, why are we still asking some of those same questions about inclusion and women's voices and our places in this story and in the movement. And so I think the issue for me, as I add to what you have said, is the issue, of course, of human trafficking. Of course, as my other sister respondents have said, the issues of gender-based violence, rape culture, sex slavery, racism, of course, and sexism, but also the notion of classism that cannot be excluded from it. These economic injustices, of course, in the Caribbean, I see those classist and racist injustices continue to permeate. Land ownership, child marriage, of course, issues as you raised, Dr. Bam, as well, sexual health and reproductive rights, food insecurity, of course, climate change and climate injustice, which leads to the environmental racism and all that we are talking about. But for me, as an African in the diaspora, two things for me as a challenge is the use of feminism, because feminism, for me, I enter the work this work as one who identifies, of course, in my Pan-Africanism and as a transnationalist, but I embrace a womanist theological lens. And I think that's something that we overlook oftentimes, again, saying that this notion of inclusion must open up. So as the first woman of African descent to hold the position that I do, where I am, within a global context, of course, linking the local and the global, I want to say that we have to expand the understanding of both of what we mean by Black feminists. And I think it's important to identify us. And as a womanist, what I am saying, using the term womanism from Alice Walker, of course, a Black feminist poet, in her book, or from her book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which creates a space for Black feminists who have been otherwise erased from our own labor and from the mainstream feminist movements, and even the ones within the African diasporic movement, because it centers whiteness, and particularly the notion of white women trying to seek to be equal with white men. What I'm saying is my approach, and many others who are in this movement, this Pan-African movement, are committed to the survival of wholeness. Yes, the survival of wholeness of our entire people, which is expanding just the notion of Black feminists. I'd love to be able to talk more, but I know where our time is short. The other issue I wanted to bring, of course, because it embraces other scholars like Dr. Stacey Floyd Thomas and others who include this radical subjectivity, traditional communalism, redemptive self-love, the four tenets, yes, and critical engagement. The other thing, of course, we cannot forget, as a woman of African descent in the Americas now, the work of reparations is so critical. And especially as we are talking about voters' rights being taken away, and again, violence that are happening, not just to Black people, but Black women in particular. Again, during COVID, issues of gender-based violence completely disproportionately affecting us. But knowing that in a global world, we are still looking at still trying to find the Chibok girls from Nigeria. They have still not been all of them still not being returned. Issues in the Americas, like the Breonna Taylors of the world being killed and slain in their very homes. And also the issue for me is, how do we respond to movements like ADOS, which is this American descendants of slavery, which is causing such a deeper divide to those Africans and African diasporic peoples living in America, which says that reparations and economic justice can only be for those who are descendants, Black descendants of slaves, and not the Black community as a whole. So these are some of the other issues on top of the main issues that you have brought, that I think when we open up this table and we include the generational conversation, the valuing the in the Americas, of course, the Black lives, the movement for Black lives, which needs to include all Black lives and Black voices, centering our stories, and I think, and that is all of us. And so I want to just say that those are the things that added. It is, and to close, it is not, in our community, in the Caribbean community, we have leadership. I mean, from prime ministers who have been in Trinidad and Tobago, in Barbados, Jamaica, we have had leadership, women's leadership for years and decades. And so this is not something that is lost on us, but these questions of how we maintain peace and security, and the difference of what that looks like for women, particularly of African and African descent in the Americas. How can we then continue to expand and what we mean by inclusion, so that we can continue to do this work of ending injustice everywhere and living in harmony with all of God's creation. I think this is the holy work that we must do. And that's not only the hope of the Church Universal and faith communities, but we must engage in our own traditions, African traditions of faith, as well as multi-faith traditions, and particularly engage engaging that with the ecumenical movement in order to protect the basic human rights of women, particularly, and fundamental freedoms for all of us in this work going forward. I have so much more to say, but I'm realizing that the time is nigh, so I will stop there. And again, thank you so very, very much for the opportunity.
Reverend Bossier, thank you for those insightful comments. And just like with all of the speakers, so substantive and so critical to how it is we come up with our declaration toward the end of this time together for the next steps. Thank you so much for your breadth of knowledge and analysis relative to the discussion. Thank you so much. Let us now begin to close our time together. I see some observations in the chat. I don't see any particular questions in the chat, but I do want to bring your attention to the observations that are in the chat. They are certainly noteworthy and certainly will help us going forward. We will be saving the chat as we develop our program to go further. We now would like to turn to Dr. Funmi Adeyemi and also to the Reverend Pastor Daniel Ayers to give us a bit of word about the upcoming Pan-African Women of Faith Halloween Conference on November 17th through the 19th. This continued conversation will take place then. They have some highlights to share for the women to be a part of on the 17th to the 19th of November, but they can quickly come. And then we will have either Dr. Fury or Reverend Ashwood to say a little bit about the assembly and also the Berlin pre-meeting and the pre-women's meeting very briefly. And then we will close with the closing prayer. And I will say a word about tomorrow's agenda in the next few days. So let's try to be brief so that we can conclude on time. Over to Dr. Funmi and then also to Pastor Danielle, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And once again, good morning. This is my name is Funmi Adeyemi, as Reverend Angelic as mentioned. I'm originally from Nigeria, but I've been in US. I actually live in Dallas, Texas. I'm really overwhelmed because this is just, it's not something that one should miss. And it's just an eye-opener. It's an eye-opener. And though we've all experienced what we've had today, but just as all the speakers have said, the most important thing is what next. Just like Paul Apostle said, that what I keep on doing is to forget those things in the past, but to look forward to what next. And that is why, this morning, as we have been working on it with our group, the Pan-African Women, African and African descent, African, with anybody from all over the world that has been coming together to work on the meeting that we are going to have on November 17th to 19th. We are going to spend time together, and the topic that we gave it is remembrance, diversity, and advocacy in unity now. This is the right time for all of us to come together to see how we can work together, to see how we can mobilize one another, to see how we can challenge one another. One of the speakers said, 70 years ago, this program started, but I look at it that up to now, we still have a lot of grounds to cover. So that is why I see that this program that we are going to have in November is very, very important. And I want to encourage you, I want to challenge you to invite a lot of people. For example, we are going to have on the first day, we are going to have our speaker, Her Excellency Elder Soka Mavuze, a EU ambassador to USA. She's going to be there. You have any question, you have any concern, you have any suggestion, bring it to that place. On that day also we are going to have All Africa Conference of Churches, Reverend Dr. Lydia Mwanike. She's going to be there. We already had from Dr. Piri today. By the way, I was in Malawi for 6 years. So I understood the culture of that place. And I know we need to come together because the uniqueness of each continent, of all the Africans that are in each continent, when we bring them together, it brings out strength, it brings out courage, it brings out wisdom on how to go about all these issues. The second day of that program, we are going to have Advocacy Day, organized already by the organization that Reverend Angelic work with. That is a Bread for the World. So we want to see you there also. In fact, that day we are going to have a representation on the Black farmers, both small Black farmers and large Black farmers, what they do, how do we impact, how do we strengthen, how do we empower all our women, not only women, but all people from African and African descent, to work together and establish something that will give us hope of coming out of poverty, of coming out of global nutrition. So the third day also, so it's going to be a 3-day pack loaded. So please plan to be part of it. And I know Pastor Daniel may have one or two things to add to it. But I will round up now by saying, I'm looking forward to see every one of us. But for what we have had today, I want also to encourage all of us, let's go back home. Let's challenge more. Let's work on our youth. Let's work on ourselves. Let's see how God can raise you up. Never look down on yourself again, but know that you are empowered this morning to go out and bear more fruit. The Lord will help us. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Over to you, Pastor Daniel.
Thank you, Dr. Fumi, and greetings to everyone. It's such a joy to be in this virtual space with so many, and it has been a blessing to be a part of this. And so Dr. Fumi really covered quite well an overview of the conference. I think the only thing I would add is that during the 3-day conference, it will also be an opportunity for us to really be able to connect and engage with each other. We will have small breakout sessions where we will ask questions of everyone so we can get to know one another, so we can connect, we can see what other people are doing in different parts of the world, where we might further build our capacity and to strengthen this movement. All of what has been laid out today, we feel the conference has been prayerfully put together. A lot of collective work has went into it, and we hope that it will only add to certainly the legacy that we've heard today that has already been laid before us, and how we might continue to do that, and how we might play a part in making sure that our churches, wherever they are in the world, can remain or become places where justice, peace, love, liberation, and healing can certainly be lived out. And I will drop in the link in the chat to everyone, the link to the conference. So we encourage you to register for that, and we look forward to seeing you in November. Thank you, Dr. Angelique.
Thank you, Pastor Ayers, and thank you, Dr. Fumi. The link to register for the Women's Conference for the Women is in the chat. Please, you can go there even now and register for the 17th through the 19th for the conference. Now, we would like to quickly go over to Dr. Feary and also Dr. Ashwood, whichever would like to talk about the future opportunities as well.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Walker-Smith. So on behalf of the World Council of Churches, we wish to invite us to ensure that this conversation, these telling of the stories and acting on the stories, sitting at the feet of our griot, doesn't end here. It is important that these conversations be brought into the main of the work and witness of the World Council of Churches. As most of you would be aware, next year, the World Council of Churches observes its 11th assembly in Karlsruhe, Germany. In that vein, we seek to prepare to live the theme, Christ's love moves the world to justice through reconciliation and unity. So justice isn't physically in the theme, but there must be that justice element in our reflections and work. As we seek to move, therefore, toward justice, or in Christ's love toward reconciliation and unity, we are on this pilgrimage, as mentioned by Professor Dr. Piri, and the pilgrimage takes us first to Berlin, where we visit that decision made many years ago that changed the course of history for Africans and people of African descent. How do we face the children of those who enslaved our parents and foreparents? The pilgrimage of justice and peace, the pilgrimage team visit to Berlin, invites us to take some of these questions into consideration as we prepare to think proactively on the trauma, the transformation, and most importantly, the way forward. Reconciliation does not come cheaply if reconciliation does not involve facing the truth about ourselves. We leave, therefore, from the pilgrimage to Berlin, and we invite each of you to be part of the conversation as we seek to restore, renew, reevaluate our identity in Christ as we gather as women and men at the pre-assembly, where we use the theme to reflect on how it is that we deal with the gaps in the conversations, least of which by no means is the conversation regarding ordination of women and what would be deemed by many as the silencing and the making invisible of women. The outcomes of the Berlin Conference, the Berlin PTV, the Women of Faith and the Women's and Men's Pre-Assembly take us directly into our assembly in September 2022. Friends, siblings in Christ, relatives, the outcomes of this critical, pivotal World Council of Churches Assembly depends on all our input as we dare to receive Christ's love and seek for reconciliation and unity in this very broken, divided, and divisive world. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Reverend Ashwood. We are putting in the chat the correct link. Unfortunately, that was misstated, but now I put it there again. For some reason, it doesn't want to go. I'm not sure why. Yes. So we thank everyone. The next few days will be very important. Tomorrow, we are very honored to have the former president of South Africa with us tomorrow. We will also hear more about racism and the issues relative to Africans and people of African descent. We will also have time to break off into regional groups to have further conversations on the matters coming from today, on tomorrow, and future days. On Monday, we will be looking at the issues relative to reparatory justice, reparations, economic issues. We will then continue, Tuesday, we'll be dealing with issues like climate change and other issues of economic concern. On Wednesday, we also will be dealing with issues of multilateralism. We will have various United Nations guests that will be with us, who will be talking about various issues, especially related to the United Nations Decade in Solidarity with People of African Descent. On Thursday, we'll be talking about Pan-Africanism for all. How is it that the global community comes alongside of what it is we do in the Pan-African space? What are the global issues that we need to be facing, even more so than the specificity of earlier discussions? On Friday will be a very important time together. The last day will be where we actually put together some mapping of the way forward based on the discussions that we would have had during the course of the week. I don't believe you'll want to miss any of the days, although you know I'm a bit biased, but I do think it will be very substantive. We'll have major scholars and thinkers, pastors and leaders, as we've had today, that will continue until the 29th of October. So please join us, only 3 hours per day. The link will be the same for each day. You will receive that if you have already registered. If you have not, please feel free, by the way, if you're interested in the conference, which I wasn't able to put in the link at the moment, to email me directly, awalker-smith@bread.org, awalker-smith@bread.org. You can contact me there. We also will put it in the chat on tomorrow. So tomorrow, look for the link to directly register. And thanks everyone for being a part of the beginnings of this exciting moment of reflection, engagement, and action that is to yield from our time together. Reverend Ashwood, it is back over to you for the closing prayer.
Thank you so very much, Reverend Dr. Walker-Smith. Friends, siblings, relatives, here we are. And we're still at the water. We have washed, we have drank, we have been washed. And perhaps for some of us, the stories of our elder sisters, the griots gathered amongst us, has led to a season of refreshing and renewal. The joy of the water is that even if we are wearing waders or galoshes or Macintoshes or the fancy boots that are now being sported by many, it is hard for us to wade in the water and not be wet. And if we at all have managed to get wet by the stories today, it is my prayer that we saw and heard ourselves in the voices gathered at the table. Of course, we recognize that we wouldn't hear all the stories in this brief time. But what we do know is that God is with us, that ever-living, ever-flowing water that takes us through the course of history, and the water that washed over the women of old represented in the Bible was a water that washed our mamas Brigalia, our mamas Isabel, our mamas Marilia, our mamas Folata, Dion, Evie, and beyond. To each of us, where we are gathered in the story. It's the same water that washes over Mama Angelique. And so, may the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the living water that flows with God's love and unites us in fellowship with God's Holy Spirit, rest, remain, refresh, restore, and renew us as we leave this space to go out in the world and help others find their renewal today and henceforth. Go with God, and may God good dopey go with you. Amen.
Amen.
And Ashe,
Amen.
see everyone tomorrow. Thank you.
Ashe, amen.
Ashe.
Amen.
Amen.